Oh, hey,
Started.
I thought of one quick thing that I can mention before we continue. For anyone who's hearing this for the first time since the spring meeting, we had success during the spring meeting at our hackathon to create a Python virtual environment that could import all the packages. And I soon plan to use that environment to deploy a new version of the PyHC gallery. And we will have that environment in there to run the examples, and we'll start promoting it more and doing more things with it. So if you've been following along with that epic, be excited, because there's actually like good movement finally. And that's the last thing I have to say.
Good job again to everyone involved on that hackathon. Let's see, so I invited Leah back here. Leah presented at the PyHC spring meeting. I think it was on the last day of the meeting, actually, on PyOpenSci. And I was really intrigued by the community and what all you guys are doing. And I was interested in furthering the conversation here to talk about how potentially PyHC can PyOpenSci-ify ourselves. So I don't know, maybe there were one or two people here that weren't at your talk. If you wanted to like summarize really quickly what you guys are before moving on, but you have the floor, Leah.
Okay, sounds great. I wondered if I might need to do a quick overview. And so I'm also on the PyHC Slack. So if folks have questions and we don't get to questions, you can always, or like after, you can always reach out to me there. So thank you so much for inviting me. And it was really cool to be at your meeting and kind of get a feel for the community. So I'm the executive director and founder of PyOpenSci, and the goal of PyOpenSci is to build diverse community around open source packages that support open science. So we're all about supporting scientific communities and individuals who are developing tools that are just furthering open science workflows. And to summarize, the core program that we're doing right now is peer review of open source software. And if you've ever heard of rOpenSci, that's a sister organization in the R space. Now we're really obviously focused on Python, hence the name. And so our community is quite different, just because it turns out the Python community is quite different from the R community. Now, our peer review is such that we have a partnership with JOSS, the Journal of Open Source Software. And so what that means is that our peer review is really focused on Python packaging. We're working on best practices, developing a packaging guide. We're working with the maintainers of tools like pip and PyPA folks and Conda folks to make sure that we're kind of up to date and our review reflects current best practices for Python packaging. So going through review with us means that you're getting this kind of more current, more focused on Python review. We also think a lot about usability and documentation and a lot of different things that are important for packages. And then finally, we think a lot about long-term maintenance of tools, because for open science, we want to think about tools that not only are good now, but in a couple of years, if people need to recreate workflows, that these tools are still maintained over time. And so we have some support built into our community where if packages become unmaintained, we want to keep track of that. We want to see if we can find new maintainers, if they are tools that people are using and they should kind of live on. And if packages need to be sunsetted, we want to let the community know and kind of gracefully go through that process. And so our partnership with JOSS means that you get all of those additional things that I just talked about in the peer review, being specific to Python, thinking about long-term maintenance, community support, but also JOSS accepts our review as theirs. So if you get accepted by PyOpenSci and you're in scope for JOSS, there are a few differences. Like JOSS, one great example is JOSS will not review API wrappers. That's not a research application, but we do. But if you're in scope for JOSS, then they accept our review and then they just review your paper. So you can get a PyOpenSci vetted badge that says PyOpenSci approved, you're part of our community. But then you can also move on to JOS if you're in scope, and they will accept the review. And then it's a very quick, fast track where you go through their process. They just look at your paper, and now you've got that JOS DOI and you've got the PyOpenSci badge and you're part of the community. So it's kind of a win-win type of scenario for maintainers if you want both. And so what I had mentioned at the community meeting and presented was this idea that we also have been thinking about how we can support communities such as PyHC. We're talking to AstroPy and some other communities right now that are interested in kind of curating these vetted lists of tools that are affiliated with the community. We have a partnership in this space specifically already with Pangeo. And maybe you have some community specific guidelines that you want to add on top of our review, which is more of a standard review looking at packaging. And we have domain specific people involved, but there's not necessarily like, by default, you're going to be connected as an Pangeo affiliated package. I'll just use them as an example. So for Pangeo, they had a few additional checks that they wanted to implement for their community to make sure and to allow for a package to become a Pangeo vetted and a PyOpenSci vetted package. And so what that looks like for Pangeo is things like they have a specific rule around how file input and output IO is handled. They want people to interface with Xarray in a very specific way. It's only, I think it's like 3 things, and they're not super complicated things, but those are the things they want all packages to maintain to be an affiliated package. And so once a Pangeo package would go through our review, if they have those additional checks, now they're going to be a Pangeo vetted tool, a PyOpenSci tool, and if they want JOS, they can have that JOS DOI as well if they're in scope. So it's kind of been like a triple win of becoming affiliated, becoming PyOpenSci supported, and becoming JOS approved. So I think what we were going to talk about today was what could that look like for PyHC. One of the things that I'll just mention, and I want to keep this short, but just like that we've talked about with multiple communities, is that everyone wants some sort of way to kind of keep tabs on package health over time. And so that's something that we definitely want to develop. I have a lot more ideas on how to do that after going to a meeting last week where there's some cool packages out there that might do some of what we want to do. And we want to build some infrastructure in the future around that. One of the other things we've talked about in good detail with AstroPy actually is what does the affiliated list look like? And I have a whole document I can share with you all, and I'll do that in just a moment, of just the discussion that we're having with AstroPy that's been cleaned up. And so you can look and you can even comment if you'd like on that document. But one of the things they're interested in is like, maybe we can have a RSS feed of accepted packages that then could feed into your website. So you could, if you wanted a list on your website, you could kind of always pull that over from ours. And we also talked about having, we're going to add a like filter by package to our package listing page, but we also talked about maybe having an AstroPy, so this could be for PyHC the same, a kind of branded page with your information about your community and just your packages on our website. So it's also something you could like link to that had PyHC on it or AstroPy or whatever the community was. So I'm just explaining to you some of the things that we've been talking with other communities about, but know that there's some flexibility here, because what I want to do is develop the best model for a partnership that really allows the communities to get what they want and need as a community. So like, I want to know what PyHC thinks they need. And then we can kind of develop the partnership that way based on the things that we think would be useful across all of these communities, but also the things that would be, excuse me, specific to the PyHC community, like, your specific branding and your requirements for being affiliated and that kind of thing. So with that, I'm going to pause. I'm going to put the link just to the AstroPy Word, the Google Doc, just so you can see kind of like what we've been talking about with them. And that might spark some questions, or maybe you already have some questions or comments for me right now.
I've been nudged to jump in with Julie's approval. So one of the things that we did last week, well, let me put this in context. So there is a movement right now in heliophysics to establish standards on, there's an effort started roughly 30 years ago to establish standards for data formats and metadata and so on and so forth. But now that open science has taken more of a strong push in the community, not only heliophysics, but wider, there's a movement for standards in more things, including software. And we were pushed by NASA headquarters to submit a section to something called the ISTP Next meeting report, due on Friday. So it was fast track on what we think those standards should be. And to put it short, we think that what the combination of PyHC and PyOpenSci standards should be the official heliophysics standards that everybody has to line up to for certain use cases. So the use cases are broad, such as basically any code you intend for other people to use needs to go through this process. And if you want agencies to be happy with you going through this process, you need to push for this, get this PyOpenSci badge and the PyHC badge, assuming it's Python, and then something similar for C, C++, Fortran, those kinds of things. But the argument that came with that is that those efforts need to have permanent funding for that to really be a community standard. So we're advocating for that and for that to be part of our infrastructure. So there you go. So we want to combine the standards here to be something that works for a broad community in heliophysics. That's broader than PyHC currently is now, but the software standards have to be there because there's a jungle. I'll leave it from there. Oh, I sent you a link to it, Leah. I'm not sure how much farther it should go than that because it's not the final draft, but I think you should at least take a read at it.
That sounds great. Did you email it to me, Rebecca? Is that where?
I just did 5 minutes ago.
Okay.
So,
okay. Thank you.
there you go.
Yeah, I can definitely take a look at that. I mean, the standards part, and obviously we're Python focused, but that part is really important. And we know that there's so many different packaging guides out there right now, and they're all levels of being dated to semi-current. And there's a ton of confusion in the community about like how to do Python packaging and what those best practices should be. And so we're really thinking about like beyond just, one specific community. We're thinking across the scientific community about the types of standards that people should be following, with the hope that we can streamline all of these different kind of things that I'm seeing in the ecosystem. And that's why we're trying to, and I've been really working hard to work with like PyPA and like some of the people that are looking across Python, knowing that we have specific needs in the scientific space because we're doing things like dealing with Fortran and things that, Django developers and other people are not dealing with. So I just wanted to like mention that is a priority for us. But I know that you had asked the question about funding, and like that's something that I'm working on. And obviously, like we're operating as a nonprofit, and so, right now I can't say like we have 10. I'd love to say we have like 10 years of funding, but we don't. But my goal is that we're working towards that. And that's what I can say in that space for right now. And I don't see us going anywhere. The other thing I can say is that we've been operating without funding since 2018. So funding is actually a new thing for us. So peer review can run without funding, but some of the other pieces that we're working on are the things that really like require funding, and I'm working hard on that. And so yeah, I just wanted to like be very transparent about that piece.
Yeah, thanks for sending that document over, Leah. It looks pretty reasonable for the kind of thing I would want to see with a partnership with PyHC so far, and I'm curious to hear more from you about what that exactly would look like. One thing I noticed is it talks about if a package is no longer maintained, talking about finding new maintainers, sunsetting. At what point do you consider a package no longer maintained? Because some packages, you make them, they serve a certain purpose, and then there might not be updates for a while, but that doesn't mean that they're not still useful and up to date. Something we've talked about in PyHC too, of like, we don't really want to kick a package out if it's being used, but at the same time, at what point do we consider it to be kind of like stale? I was just curious what your standard for that was.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've been talking about that, and actually AstroPy had the same exact comment. And this is why it's so cool to be talking to these communities, right? Because there's so many communities right now that are trying to solve the same thing. And so it's really great, because I think if we can kind of come to consensus, imagine like we're going to have similar types of standards across all communities is like my vision and goal. And so I love that I'm hearing kind of the same types of things. That means we're doing the right thing and moving in the right direction. So what we talked about with AstroPy so far, and where my thoughts are so far, is that ultimately we want to have a dashboard that kind of gives us a sense of like how active the package is, when people have been, when was the last commit, when was the last release, like has there been activity? But we do understand that in some cases, a package might just be good enough and like hasn't had updates, and that could happen. And so we also have been talking about, and I've actually already done this, so just like emailing the maintainers once a year, or just checking in to make sure like there's someone that's still actively involved in the package. And I have one package in our ecosystem right now where I emailed the maintainer multiple times. They haven't responded. There hasn't been a commit or a release in several years. Like, I haven't sunsetted it yet, but I think that that's going to be one example of like, if someone's just like not responding at all on GitHub, on email, it's been for that package a couple of years, we want to sunset it. We can talk about that more, but that's my thought right now. We look at all the checks. So we have imagine this dashboard. That's something that I want to develop. And we see that there's some flags in the like health checks, but that's not enough just to sunset something. So then the next step would be an email that goes out to the maintainer, or maybe a ping on GitHub, or maybe both. And we see if we get a response. We give them a month or two to respond. That's my thought process right now, but I'm really open. I think it's going to be something we're going to have to kind of like try out, because I certainly wouldn't want to sunset a package that people are using. And obviously we're not like tearing down GitHub or anything. We're just kind of gracefully moving it out of, these are maintained packages from our list. But I'm very open if other people have thoughts or even concerns about what I've already mentioned and what's in that AstroPy document, because that's just where my thinking is around that right now.
Well, I have two comments, but I talk too much, so go ahead, Sean.
I'll say my two things first.
Okay.
One is, I know the whole idea of keeping track of when the last time someone committed to a repo, or just generally seeing if a package is still being maintained. It's something that we have some agreement across PyHC that we would like to track as well. At the PyHC spring meeting, we talked about even trying to add that information on the projects page somewhere. But it occurs to me that if we had a partnership with you all, and if you tracked that kind of info on your kind of dashboard, we wouldn't have to duplicate that functionality. So that would be useful. Second quick thing, this was sort of unrelated, so as soon as I say this, I'll let Rebecca take the floor again. But you talked about having like a PyOpenSci badge and stuff, and I wanted you to remind me if you literally have like a GitHub like README badge for when people, and if you could show that off.
Yeah, we do. Let me find an example. That's something we've had for a while, but we need to update, I think, our logo.
And I think I'll go ahead and say it might be worth bringing that Google Doc actually into a screen share at some point in this call, in case not everyone's clicked the link and looked through the doc.
Totally. Let me do a quick. So I'm going to share Pandera, which is a package that actually went through our review years ago. Can everyone see my screen? Thumbs up.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So you can hopefully see at on the very top row that PyOpenSci's peer-reviewed badge is right there. So that is something that we've always had as a part of our review. So that would be something that you would get. And then, oh, maybe this one didn't go through Joss. He might not have gone through Joss actually. But if you had Joss, then you would get that as well. Okay, thanks, John. So I see the thumbs up. So I'm also then going to pull over to make sure. Okay, so this is the Google Doc. Did you see that I switched my tab? Just want to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, cool. So this is where I just started talking. Essentially what we did is we've been having conversations with AstroPy for some time. And so I sat down, I was at a scientific Python developer summit last week. And so I sat down with one of the AstroPy folks leading this effort. And we just made this into a nice consolidated document because I thought that this might be helpful for you all. And because again, it's like I'm getting a lot of the same questions, which is great. And so this re-review of packages section is really where we started talking about the automated checks and the dashboard that kind of tracks health. There's two things going on in scientific Python right now that we've been talking with them. Like I'm very closely partnered and work with them, like Stefan, I talk to him regularly. So they've created this package called DevStats that captures some of the metrics. I've done some work to already automate some of that for our packages as well. And then there's this repo review tool that came out of Scikit Hub. So it's a physics scientific Python community. And that I think is a tool that we'll be able to write custom plugins for to be able to kind of automate some of these checks. And then one of the last things that we do have planned already. So I think like the dashboard and the checks, like that's going to be a separate chunk of funding to actually build out some of that. But I want to build a proof of concept first. But the other thing that we do have funding to do right now is that we're going to get a bot that's going to automate some of these processes as well in our peer review process. And that's through a partnership with Joss. So anyways, there's a bunch of like content here that might be helpful for you to just check out to understand like what we've been thinking about after talking with AstroPy. Okay, so I'll pause again. I'm sure there's other questions.
I have my 2 comments, but
Yeah, Rebecca, I was going to encourage you to go. I'll just say that you've inspired me, Leah, to create a README badge for PyHC. So that's going to happen now.
That would be great. I think AstroPy has one as well. I think that would be awesome.
Okay, back to the sunset discussion. I think the special case, although I don't have a specific example in mind, but I think a special case would be when the package maintainer is no longer maintaining it, but bunches of people are still using it. Do you have a mechanism to figure out how many people are using a given package?
That's an interesting thought. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be pretty easy to, and I know these aren't the best numbers, but there would be like, we could look at PyPy and Conda downloads, which I know those are bloated with CI installs and that kind of thing. But that could give us a sense like downloads per month. But I think that in terms of use, gosh, I have to think about that a little bit more.
There might be a way to like recursively look through other repos to see where it's listed as like a requirement or things like that.
That's a really good idea. Yeah, that's a really good idea. Actually, the dev stats, oh, I see a cute cat. At Scientific Python, they were talking about, I bet we could partner with them on this. They were talking about going through APIs to understand like how much of a package's API was being used as dependencies like across. I bet we could pull that type of workflow out and then generalize it to just be like, where is the package being used, to kind of build on what you just suggested, Sean. I'm just taking notes.
Yeah, I love that idea. Oh, and real quick, what was that package you showed us a second ago that had your badge on GitHub?
Oh, it's Pandera.
Pandera, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay,
And
yep.
if you want, let me give you another link, just because there's a few packages that hadn't, every once in a while, someone forgets to add. But if you go, I'll just put a link in the chat as well here. Got too many things open. But this is our package list. I just put that in the chat. So if you go to that, you can see the accepted packages, and then you can go to their GitHub and kind of see. I think most of them should have, let me even go and double check. Yeah, so like XClim was just accepted, and you can see they have their JOS and their PyOpenSci badges there.
Nice. I like how they actually have a table that's now categorizing all the different badges they have. That's actually fairly new for me to see.
I like that too. It makes it really clean and clear.
So my second comment is partially answered by what's happened in the chat since the question happened, but about creating, you talked about a science field wide Python standard. And from the comments in the chat, it sounds like that community's happening, sorry, that conversation is happening at the Scientific Python Summit meetings. Apparently one of them was last month. So Julie's already jumping into that one. Are you, Leah, interested or able, rather, I guess both, sorry. Are you able to jump in on that conversation and help us collaborate with other science fields on Python software standards?
Yeah, so actually Scientific Python, so Stefan and Jared, I talk to them regularly. So I was at that summit. It was just 2 weeks ago. I just got back. And so I guess I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to there, but what they did at that summit is they moved the PyHC packaging guide over into the Scientific Python. I'm sorry, this Scikit HEP, the Python physics community. So that's Henry Schreiner. And they moved his guide into the Scientific Python space. I've actually been doing most of the work on packaging standards. We have a packaging guide that I've been developing, and we have, again, folks from Conda Forge, PyPay, like that's work that I've been doing for the past, well, since the fall. And then I like coordinate with Scientific Python really, really closely on that work. And the space that they've been incredibly helpful is what they're focused on right now is the core Python packages. So like matplotlib, numpy, scipy, and a lot of packages that have challenging packaging issues, like they're dealing with Fortran, they're dealing with C++ and complicated builds. And so they're really focused on standardizing across that core ecosystem, but they're a little bit less involved in the communities, which is kind of what we're doing. So that's a good way to think about like the difference between their organization and ours, is that like we're working with the more domain specific packages and they're really working with the core packages. And then together we're kind of a complete picture of hitting all of the packages in the ecosystem. So, you know, I could definitely like, I'm not sure exactly what you're looking for with that question or comment, but I'm happy to like address other questions, or if you wanted to kind of chat with Stefan and Jared, I could facilitate that if there was something specific, or yeah, if you could just give me a little more information, I'd be happy to kind of like fill in the gaps there.
Sure. So Julie should definitely be the one spearheading this, so don't take too much from me. But from my perspective, I'm kind of approaching this more from, well, what do we tell NASA headquarters that we want? across heliophysics. So are you telling me that PyOpenSci is working on one part of the software standards and then the scientific Python is working on another part of the software standards?
I think that we're working on like the packaging standards. So like our packaging guide, we're reviewing all of the tools, and scientific Python is really focused on supporting the core packages. So rather than like, they do have Henry's guide that they just moved to their website, but that's like kind of Henry's, how do I see this? That's very much like Henry's thoughts on packaging, whereas our guide is really a like broader community effort. So I think that the best way, the cat is so cute, the best way to kind of distinguish the two organizations is that they're supporting core packages like Matplotlib, NumPy, SciPy. They're not really working with other communities like PyOpenSci is. So if you're looking for an organization, like we're looking at across all of the communities, all of the smaller domain specific packages, and they're really focused on the core packages. And that guide that you see on their website is the physics guide that Henry moved over during the summit. That's not necessarily a community driven thing. It's something that he wanted to put in a more public place. And so it got moved into their ecosystem. So they're not actually like, Stefan and Jared are not actively like working on standards. I've been working on the standards. And then I talk to Stefan like multiple times a week on Discord. So I hope that's helpful. So like I see our guide as the community standards for packaging across the ecosystem. But if we have questions about something like Fortran, then I'm definitely going to go to Stefan and Jared and see what they're doing. Like they're moving everyone right now to Meson Python. That's where all the core packages are moving right now for complex builds. So
Okay.
I hope that's helpful.
It's more like your expert help resources. Because
Yeah.
they're dealing with the big ones.
Yeah, they're
Okay.
dealing with the big ones and they're dealing with those like really complex builds. So any kind of standard that we develop around that, like that's going to be a partnership with them. And frankly, like our whole guide, like people from that community reviewed it. I mean, we had dozens of people review our guide. So they're involved. Like we're very much complementary organizations, but I don't think that they would come to a meeting like this and talk about packaging standards. Like that's definitely our scope. In the same way, like I wouldn't go to a Matplotlib team meeting and talk about packaging there because that's just not the scope of PyOpenSci.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to say that for Plasma Pi, we're like part of PyHC and also trying to build our own ecosystem. I'm really interested in us being a part of PyOpenSci also. Probably not right away, but sometime like during the late part of the PyHC getting started. So.
Yeah, one thing on that is that, you know, going through a software review process takes time and we don't work for free. So I think one thing, once all of this gets figured out, I think, this is my opinion, so take it as that, but I think all of the core packages need to write some sort of HTM proposal for a little funding to go through this process as the trial packages, because those are the packages that are presumably the most mature. And those are the ones that, you know, would be the best test cases on how to figure this out and what the links should be and that kind of stuff. But so if you want help writing those HTM proposals, that's we could work on that in a Telecon and a Google Doc and copy and paste and whoever.
I think that's an excellent idea, and I'd be more than happy to devote some Telecon space to it. And contribute however I can.
Would it be helpful to talk a little bit about so a couple of things. One, I think I saw David on this call, because David, I think you had emailed me. So I want to make sure if like you had any thoughts or questions, or if you just want to listen. I don't want to call you out awkwardly, but I just saw that you were on this call.
Yeah, hi. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, so I'm kind of sneaked in from more of the SunPy side. Because we also currently have a like series of affiliated package and our own review process. And we found, and we still find, that it kind of takes a fair bit of effort to like maintain that process. And it took a lot of thinking to come up with the process and to start with, and it actually overlaps a lot with PyOpenSci. So yeah, we are potentially keen on partnering as well. Yeah, I guess I don't know if anyone coming from more of the PyHC side on the call had any thoughts on overlap between heliophysics and solar physics, and whether there's room for a separate heliophysics and SunPy community, and sorry, heliophysics and solar physics community, or whether you would be keen to collaborate on one PyOpenSci community. Yeah.
Here's a thought. I don't like the idea of them being separate. I personally like the idea of basically the tree being PyOpenSci with PyHC and then other disciplines underneath that. And then under PyHC, you have the different heliophysics communities underneath that, such as the SunPy community. I imagine there to be some kind of community around more time series data that isn't image based, and then maybe a community based on model data, or that gets split between the two or something like that. But I see it more of a tree like that. And I think that will have more of a unity, but in the logistical process, you'd have to definitely be a strong voice in what the final tree of standards are between PyHC and then, PyOpenSci, then PyHC, and then the SunPy community. And similarly for PlasmaPy, Nick, that you were talking about, as a different group under that, different community of packages there. And all have your own badges, of course. So definitely help us figure that out.
Yeah, I think also one thing worth mentioning is like duplication and stuff. So I think one of the big differences between PyHC and SunPy that I've seen in the past is in SunPy, we kind of really strongly try and keep like one data structure for time series data, one data structure for map-like data, and we pretty strongly require that affiliated packages use that to avoid duplication. Whereas in PyHC, I get the impression that you take a slightly different approach and don't have that requirement, and there hasn't been a big push to deduplicate stuff like that.
Right, so the SunPy group of packages would be a subset under PyHC, where the range of packages in PyHC can determine their own data structure. Then the SunPy community has this data structure, and so on and so forth. Does that make sense? Does that sound good? Julie, am I talking too much?
No, you're fine. I'm just listening.
Okay.
For me.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess maybe one question I have for you, Leah, is who reviews the packages? So are there like representatives from each community? So like, do Pangeo have a set of people who review their packages?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. And I have a few other thoughts about all of this in terms of like sub communities. I'll throw out over the fence, but let's answer that question first. So absolutely. So and this kind of gets into like, what does the partnership look like between us and your respective communities? Ideally, so we have four people that are involved in a review generally. There's the editor-in-chief, there's the editor, and then we have 2 reviewers. And so normally the editor-in-chief is like a general step of just basic packaging requirements that should be, there should be docs and tests and that kind of thing that's generic, that shouldn't be domain specific. And so they perform those checks. The editor, however, we would like that editor to be domain specific whenever possible. And so that's where we'd really love to have engagement with these communities we'd like to have, depending on the volume of packages, which is something we'll have to figure out. But I was imagining like maybe we start with like 1 or 2 editors per community, and we see if that's enough. I've been growing our editorial team, but we really like to have domain specificity. I would like that particularly for the partnerships, because I would love to be able to trust that the editor can then say like, yes, this is a SunPy vetted tool, or yes, this is PyHC. Like I'd rather that not come from me or from some other editor that's like not involved in the community. The reviewers, then we try to get reviewers that are specific, that have some domain specific knowledge related to the package. At least one of them, we want to have some expertise. We're okay if the second one is a little bit more broad, because sometimes having a lens of not domain specific can help with like usability and documentation. When I read the README, do I know what the package does? Does it install? So sometimes we have a mixture of reviewers, but we want at least one to be a domain expert, and sometimes both people are. And so that's where, what we talked with AstroPy about is making calls to your respective communities and getting help from you to spread the word, to get people to sign up to be a reviewer. And that just makes it easier for the editor to find people. Finding reviewers is normally the piece of the review that can take the most time, just to find people that have time. And so that's what we've been doing. And sometimes it's just, oh, we have this package and we do a call out on social media, or people know maybe the editor knows people that they can ping. And so that process might vary a little bit, but it is really important that we have that vetting process. And I think coming from your community, we'd really like to have that engagement where we run the infrastructure around peer review, but we'd like to have individuals from your community serve as editors. So we have that like check in place for, yes, this can be a vetted PyHC tool. I'm a part of this community. This meets the standards. We'd love to see it happen that way. So I hope that helps. And then that brings the question of, and we don't have to talk about details now, but I'd love for you all to start thinking about like, what would the requirements look like to be a PyHC or a SunPy or a Plasma Pi vetted tool? And so if you start to take that PyHC community, and then there's kind of tiers of sub communities that are a little bit more specific, if that becomes the model, whatever, you can decide what the model is there. I wouldn't make that decision, but since I heard that, I'm going to respond to that and say like, maybe there's 3 PyHC things, and then SunPy adds an additional thing that's specific to SunPy. I don't know what the specific standards are yet, but that would be something we'd want to talk about. If that doesn't make sense and you all decide it doesn't make sense, then we could talk about a different structure. But again, Pangeo has like very clear, these are the 3 things that you need to have to be a Pangeo tool. And after that, like we could go through review and vet them based on them having like those 3 checks, and then they become Pangeo affiliated. So I hope that that's helpful, and please ask more questions if it's not.
Cool. Yeah, that's definitely super helpful from the SunPy side. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Wonderful. I see some questions in the chat here too.
Please answer Nabil's question first.
Okay.
I can comment on mine in a moment.
Does Pangeo require X-ray to be the base? Oh yeah, let me show you, Nabil. Let me show you their specific. It's in our packaging guide. So what we haven't talked about is kind of like what this looks like on our website and in the guide. So let me go to, oh no, peer review guide. I wanted to go to, oh, why is that not here? Interesting. Give me a second. Okay, so I'm going to put a link in the chat, and I'm going to also share my screen just so you all don't have to go to that link if you don't want to. So I'm just sharing our peer review guide right now, and this is good if you want to just check out our processes and see if you have any thoughts or feedback or questions based on that. But if you go to the peer review guide and you go to our partners page, you'll see that there's a Pangeo page that describes the partnership, and then almost, I'll put a link to this too, but you can see the specific requirements that they have. So they're not particularly like stringent, detailed requirements, but they're just high level things that the community thinks are really important associated with what types of data structures are used, how people interact with data, making sure there's lazy loading. So hopefully that's helpful. And I'll put that specific link in the chat as well, just to that section. Okay. Yeah, of course. That was a great question.
Related, well, not related question. On staffing the reviewers, would it be useful for members of PyHC to aid PyOpenSci in reviewing packages not in heliophysics? Or would we just be too ignorant of the other things?
That's a great question. So I definitely don't believe in ownership, you know, like if there's a package that someone from the PyHC community was interested in reviewing, like we'd welcome that. Again, I think that there's a few pieces that are really valuable for us in terms of like leading the review, thinking about packaging standards when we're interfacing with communities. Like one, we love the idea that people aren't reinventing the wheel in terms of standards and peer review and like vetting tools and looking at maintenance over time. Like we love the idea of us having this lens across the ecosystem and working with all of the communities. So we're working together. And so we're avoiding some of that replication. The other thing that I think is really useful is that because we have this lens across the ecosystem, not only can we start to enforce best practices and encourage best practices in packaging and documentation, but we can also start to think about like, what if there's some helper tool that exists in like PyHC that also might exist in Pangeo or some other community. And that could happen where maybe like everyone's dealing with spatial data. And so people create tools that have some overlap. We like the idea of that visibility of like, okay, we know there's several tools now that do something similar. And if one of the tools becomes unmaintained, is there some opportunity to like consolidate resources and get maintainers to work together? I don't know, but I like the idea of having that lens. And so with that said, I don't think that reviews should be like stuck strictly to like, this has to be PyHC, because there's a lot of people that are interdisciplinary working across domains as well. And so I think that that does not need to be a strict thing of only reviewers in PyHC review PyHC packages. And we can just see how that goes. Like in the same way, maybe there's a PyHC package that comes in. There's other people that from the outside that just might not be involved with PyHC, but they might have a lot of expertise there.
Okay.
So I hopefully that helps. That like I see this as being something open, but we do want to make sure that the quality of review is solid. But like I don't think that we need to like work in these little silos, not little silos, but I don't think we need to work in a silo. I think we can think across the ecosystem and then choose reviewers that make sense as packages come in.
So I assume you have a training process to train reviewers for PyOpenSci, and that we would need one in PyHC as well.
We don't have a formal training process. What we have are guides that people follow. training hasn't been a problem so far, but if you have specific questions about this, please let me know. Let me show you what our guides look like. So if you go into our peer review guide, we have an author guide, a reviewer guide, editor, so you can like really go through and see all the steps. So if you go through, and we did this because we realized when people were starting to work with us that they had a lot of questions. And so what we tried to do is make the process as clear as possible. Now, what we do offer, if someone comes in and they're like, I really do want support or training, like I don't want to just do this review on our own, what we do offer is kind of a mentorship option where someone could come in and we'll like pair you up with someone else that is familiar with the review process and provide help and support. But we haven't needed to do any like formal training. We've just been trying to update our guides so that people can kind of follow the process. And then in the guide, if you kind of scroll through, you'll see that we've got some templates and things for people to like see, you know, what this looks like. This is the template for actually what the review should look like. So this would be the thing that they could copy into the GitHub issue and make sure that they're checking all the boxes. So that's been our process so far, and it's worked pretty well so far. We've been doing it for about 4 years. So, you know, if there are any hiccups when we got started where people really did want some sort of training or something more formal, we could totally talk about that. But so far we haven't needed to do that.
So I've been trying to make a list about what the packages would need to include in their HTM funding, and check me on this. So they would need funding for going through the OpenSci review process, then the PyHC review process, any sub-community review process, and then funding to review 2 other PyHC packages through both processes. And then optionally review a PyOpenSci that's not in PyHC, and then any training needed for those review processes. Am I missing anything?
I don't think so. I mean, so, and I totally appreciate this. One of the things I'll just mention is all of our reviewers have been volunteer so far, but I think it's great. Like if there's funding to support some of this, I think that that's awesome. But I'm just letting you know that like in JOS is the same way, our OpenSci is the same way, that the review process has been volunteer. It's actually volunteer led and run. But again, like if you can get funding for this, I think that's amazing. The other thing is that I would hope that there's not like so many different review processes. This is the way we normally would do a community partnership review. It's kind of embedded all in the same review. So what we would want to do is initially when the package came in, for Pangeo right now, we have a box that says like, are you part of Pangeo? And we need to update our form. We're updating our form right now because when we started, we only had Pangeo. We knew we were going to work with Pangeo. And so if we have more communities, we're going to just know that we're going to make space so that it can allow for growth of community partnerships. But typically that check for like, can this package be a part of that community happens up front. And for Pangeo, it's like those 3 things, and it's pretty easy to check that. Like we ask the author, and then we can look at the package, and it's pretty clear if they're like using Xarray and such at that point. I guess my question for you, Rebecca and Julie and everyone here is like, what do you envision your checks to look like? And I don't want you to like be forced to answer that right now if you're not ready to, but I'd like you to think about that, because what we wouldn't want is like 3 reviews. Like we wouldn't want a PyOpenSci review and then like a PyHC review to happen after that, and then a SunPy review after that, or Plasma. Like I feel like that would be a lot for an author to have to go through that. I'd much rather see a consolidated process where, and what I would like to see happen is the editor who is a part of one of these said communities that we partner with can do the initial vetting of like, is this enough? Does this package qualify to be a PyHC package? So then it goes into the review with like, we know that it is designed in such a way that it could be that type of package, or it could be affiliated. And that's the way our editor-in-chief checks work as well. So I'll take a tiny step back in the process and say that our initial checks for a package to even begin review, the basic standards that we want to see across the entire community, those happen before the formal review even happens. And if a package doesn't meet, like it doesn't have API documentation, or it doesn't have tests, or maybe it doesn't have like test coverage is like 20%, and we'd like it to be, you know, a little bit more robust. Like at the very beginning, we'll tell that package that they're not going to move on to review until they kind of improve the basic infrastructure of their package. And what is nice about that is if they do that work at the beginning to improve their package, they're very likely going to be successful in the review process. Like I don't anticipate rejecting a lot of packages. We're not about trying to reject packages. We're about encouraging people to follow best practices and like create better software. And so with that said, I would love for the community specific standards to be such that we could vet those standards at the beginning. The editor could do that part, and that editor has the domain expertise that would facilitate them, like allow them, enable them to be able to make those checks. And then once it gets into the more in-depth review, then the reviewers can dive into the rest. So in my mind, that's an ideal, efficient workflow. If something else is kind of coming up in your head, Rebecca or anyone, please let me know. But I think the more streamlined the process is, the better, because it is a lot of work for folks. It's work for the reviewers, and it's work for the author, the package authors. So I love to streamline things.
So I'll leave the standards question up to Julie, but what I picture from what you're saying is that they would do a check, choose from a list of options where it was PyOpenSci /PyHC/general, and then another option might be PyHC/SunPy, and so on and so forth. And they would choose the review process they would want. Does that fit with what you're talking about?
I think so. I mean, I think what we have right now on the forum is that it says, are you a Pangeo affiliated, or do you want to be a Pangeo affiliated package? You just click that. So I could see that adding the box for PyHC, and then, you know, David and Julie and we would talk about if there is a hierarchy or not. Like I have no opinions about that. We could talk about that more, but I could just see like a SunPy checkbox, and Nick in the future, a Plasma Pi checkbox, and then a link there for the author to go over to the standards for those communities and at least initially acknowledge, like, yes, I think I pass all these checks. Like, let the author initially self-identify, and then we can have someone double check it. That's someone ideally being an editor. That's kind of what I would envision happening. That's what we've done with Pangeo so far. We just haven't had a lot of Pangeo packages to test it like over time yet.
Okay. One last question before Julie kicks me out. So when these when the PyHC packages submit this proposal to get HTM funding for this process, should that proposal also include funding for the editors to pay for their time?
That's a great question. So again, the thing that's a little bit tricky here is that our entire review process has been volunteer driven.
That can't be sustainable long term, though. Somebody has to get paid. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, Joss, there's other, I think most journals operate that way. So I hear you. Maybe this is a separate conversation that we just like talk about. I mean, we could talk about it here, but I'm just telling you that like people do volunteer to be editors, and it has been sustainable for other organizations, and I think most journals don't pay people to do that. Right. But if you wanted to get funding, I'm not saying you couldn't. Like if you want to get funding for folks, you could. It's just not our model. Like we don't pay people to do that part.
But if we're going to require it, then that makes it interesting. But I'll hush. I think Julie's been trying to.
You don't have to hush. Like I think that if PyHC wanted to, you know, find money to support some of these processes and like provide stipends to folks to participate because it's a required part of your community. I mean, I think that that could be fine. I just need to be really clear, like we couldn't pay all of our editors and editor-in-chief. Like we have a fairly specific, that just wouldn't be sustainable for us. And there's other organizations that are leading peer review that don't have a paid model. So I'm not arguing with you, and like, I think it's wonderful. Like if people can get paid for their time, that's great. But I think it would need to come from like PyHC, because I know as an organization, like we couldn't support paying like all of our reviewers and all of our editors. That hasn't been a model that's been implemented in other communities. That's all I'm saying.
That makes sense. I think Rebecca's context is coming from the fact that we do have that HTM funding pool where you can submit proposals. I forget, is there like a specific date for that, or is it a rolling process? Or
I can never keep that straight.
but if the funding is there and available, I think it's coming from the mindset of why not?
Totally.
Applying for it for PyHC people, but certainly we wouldn't expect high open side to fund that effort.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I just need to make sure, like, I see some comments in the chat coming through as well. Like, I just want to be really careful about, it couldn't come from us. That's all. I'm not saying I don't support it. I think it's wonderful. Like if y'all can get funding on your side to implement that, go for it. It just can't come from us, because I know that that's right now, like not sustainable for us to keep running. And our editorial team is going to get quite big, I think, over time. So yeah, I mean, if I can support in any way, like if you do write a proposal, like I'd be happy to like write a letter of support or like whatever that would look like, but I just couldn't promise that to like our entire editorial team. Like that would just need to come from your community and be something that you kind of manage. Yeah. Yeah, no, Rebecca, I totally appreciate where you're coming from.
Be nice if we could just have a funding process for all reviewers.
I know. And it's just, I mean, I think as all of you know, it's like this open source space is so tricky because it's really hard. It's hard to get funding, and particularly what's hard to get funding for is maintenance, right? It's like, yeah, we can do a shiny new thing and write proposals for that, but it's a lot harder to think about like, how do we maintain this thing over time? And so I have some ideas for PyOpenSci. And at some point, like, you know, at least like stipends or something would be really nice. It's just a tricky space. And I'm trying to kind of figure this out right now.
Sure. Well, we're running over a little bit, so unfortunately, I'm going to have to wrap this up. But this was a really good conversation, and I think it might make sense to have another Telecon sometime in the near future to keep talking and keep this communication going. And in my mind, at least for the PyHC community, maybe we could have a Telecon where we look through our standards document again and make sure it's still where we want it to be, it's up to date. Do we want to make any changes? I think that idea has been brought up to me once or twice. So. And from this conversation, it's something like that would be a good idea regardless. So thanks again, Leah, for coming and talking once more with us about the PyOpenSci and PyHC potential, collaboration. Looking forward to talking more.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me. And it was great to see y'all again, and just get in touch if you have any questions or thoughts after this Telecon. I'm on the Slack. I put my email in the chat. So just feel free to reach out.
Cool. That's good.
Thanks, Leah. Thanks, Julie.
Bye.